The parables of Jesus were the subject on the last two occasions I was up here, the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan specifically. And we delved into the backgrounds and the meanings in them that went beyond the obvious. Today we will do the same with the last in this series, this time the Pharisees and the tax collector. The full meanings of Jesus' parables can be puzzling, and in none of them more so than in this one. But let me remind you again that the disciples had some difficulties understanding it. And they asked Jesus why he used parables when he spoke to the people. The message puts Jesus' reply to them this way. You've been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. Not everyone has this gift, this insight. It hasn't been given to them, meaning the people that he's been speaking to. Whenever anyone has a ready heart for this, meaning his message, the insights and understandings flow freely. But if there is no readiness, any trace of receptivity disappears. That's why I tell stories, to create readiness, to nudge people toward receptive insight. In their present state, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen till they're blue in the face and not get it. I don't want Isaiah's forecast repeated all over again. Your eyes are open, but you don't hear a thing. Your ears are open, but you don't hear a thing. Your eyes are awake, but you don't see a thing. But you, and this is talking to the disciples, you have God-blessed eyes, eyes that see, and God-blessed ears that hear. A lot of people, prophets, and humble believers among them, would have given anything to see what you are seeing, to hear what you are hearing, but never had the chance. If we, that's you and I, believe in Jesus, as the disciples did, and have a ready heart, then we too have already made a significant start toward being able to understand the parables, as our eyes and ears will have been opened to enable us to better see and hear. But we still need to exercise our minds to reach the fuller meanings. This is the way the parable reads in the Message. This story Jesus told to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance and who looked down their noses at the common people. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee posed and prayed like this: "Oh God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, crooks, adulterers, or heaven forbid, like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and tithe all my income." Meanwhile, the tax collector, slumped in the shadows, his face in his hands, not daring to look up, said, "God have mercy, forgive me, a sinner." Jesus commented, "This tax collector, not the other, went home made right with God. If you walk around with your nose in the air, you're going to end up flat on your face. But if you're content to be simply yourself, you will become more than yourself. This parable appears so simple and straightforward, and to have a quality of meaning so self-evident that further examination would seem to be wasted effort. But often we overlook the full meaning of those things with which we are most familiar, for the very reason that they are so familiar. And this may well be true of this parable. And because of this familiarity, the two characters whom our Lord portrays with such simplicity have become simplified and stereotyped in our imaginations to the extent that we are likely to lose track of what these people really are or were, and to treat the story as just black and white portrayals of the two men, with nothing more to them beyond that which the few words attributed to Jesus have given. And again, because of the familiarity with the story and the massive changes in culture between there, then, and here, now, we will probably lose much of its original meaning. For instance, today, in our minds, the word Pharisee is synonymous with legalist or hypocrite. And as a hypocrite, largely because of this parable, perhaps. And to us, the taxman is at worst an annoyance, but just someone doing an essential job. In Jesus' world, though, the Pharisees were the most popular group of Jewish leaders. They were widely admired by the ordinary farmers and fishermen and so-called people of the land. They were descendants of a reform group in Judaism from the 2nd century BC. Their goal was to bring the laws of Moses up to date and into context with and applicable to the modern living of that time, so that God's people could know how to be obedient in every situation with as few grey areas as possible. The Pharisees believed that to receive God's blessing, and the foremost yearning that they had was that with God's blessing was that they'd get rid of their Roman rulers. To receive God's blessing was contingent on their achieving a significant measure of obedience among themselves and among the populace as a whole. They didn't believe so much in doing good works to get saved. They considered they were already saved by virtue of being Jewish, as they did in following detailed laws in order to stay saved, as we might say today. There was a common Pharisaic prayer in which the Pharisaic male thanked God that he was created a free man and not a slave, a Jew and not a Gentile, a man and not a woman. Carol. Paul was referring to this in Galatians 3:28 when he inverted that by saying, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Back to the Pharisees again. The Pharisees were very nationalistic, and they held an intense hatred of Gentiles. That is, people of other nationalities and religions. In that they were not so different from the fundamentalist Jews in Israel today, who was so very agreeable that Israel should accept aid and support from the nominally Christian West, while at the same time despising those of the West. And it was politics that made the first century Jewish tax collectors, on the other hand, so despised. The average Jew believed that tax collectors had sold out to the enemy by working for the occupying Roman forces. In general, at the time, Judaism tended to ostracize what we might call down and out people, the poor, the sick, particularly lepers, as well as members of other ethnic groups like Samaritans and Gentiles, all people who in general in Israel at the time were not well-off people. The tax collectors, though, were the only fairly well-off, well-to-do category who were equally ostracised. We shouldn't touch up too much about all that, though, as there are plenty of groups in our society, and here in Australia, that carry a stigma, even if it is not stated openly. The very poor, the homeless, teenage mothers, some migrant groups, AIDS sufferers, and so on. Mainly people who are not well-to-do. Does that make us feel uncomfortable? Another insight to the way tax collectors were thought of is seen in Matthew 10, which refers in the one breath to tax collectors and sinners. And then in Matthew 21:31, where in the parable of the two sons, Jesus says, "I tell you the truth, the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you." So much for the Pharisees and tax collectors and how they were thought of. The Bible is a book with a storyline. And we're used to our stories having good guys and bad guys. And to us, generally speaking, the Pharisees were among the bad guys, along with other Jewish groups, because they wanted Jesus dead. But we're inclined to overlook or be unaware of the fact that the Pharisees were, as a group, good people, solid citizens, pillars of society. We would be very happy to have a solid core of people of this calibre amongst us. In their minds, though, any suggestion that an itinerant preacher, a humble carpenter of all things, and from out in the sticks of Galilee, at that, was the promised Messiah, the king sent by God to save Israel. It was incomprehensible to them. But this man Jesus was getting a significant following, to the extent that to them he had become a threat to the well-being of the Jewish nation and had to be stopped. All quite reasonable and understandable considering the times. The Pharisee in this parable, this old guy up here, is usually pictured like that. A man basking in the glory of his own self-righteousness. A man who never lets a conversation or a prayer go by without making clear all his points of excellence and lapping up every bit of admiration that comes his way. But if that is all this parable implies, there's not a great deal of depth to it. But this interpretation is precisely what the Pharisee is not. And if the tax collector was really so touchingly and sentimentally humble as he appears in our imagination and in this painting, then again the point of the parable would be more commonplace and obvious. But the tax collector was not like that at all. On the contrary, he was probably a rather rough individual who had entered the service of the occupying Romans and fleeced his own people for the benefit of his own pocket, and would be what we would call a collaborator. And then again, the Pharisee is a man who is in dead earnest about his service to God. We can tell whether a person's heart is in something which just affects his stomach or his wallet. Business is business, and for many people, this is where sentiment and Christianity, too, for that matter, end. But not with the Pharisee. He fasted and sacrificed and cut down his standard of living for God. For him, God was at least as real as the money in his pocket. These things shouldn't be overlooked. But if we do come to realise the merits of his class, we will begin to realise that the Pharisee of the story is probably a highly respected man in his society. People who heard him pray would have sensed that he wasn't uttering empty words, that he was what he said he was. He was not one who would say, we commend these offerings to such and such a charity, and then pocket the money and keep it for himself, as the tax collector might have done. People have a good instinct for a man's sincerity. And while the tax collector was only a corrupting influence upon the community, the Pharisee works faithfully and sacrificially to preserve its holy traditions and its faith according to his beliefs, which were the beliefs of God's people, let's face it. The community senses that its foundations are in good hands as long as he stands for what he does. But Jesus was well aware of all this. When we see it this way, it becomes not at all self-evident that he should praise the tax collector and condemn the Pharisee. We may suppose Jesus did not criticise a respected, in many ways, a venerable figure without great sadness of heart. But this is often apparent. It is often apparent that God sees things differently from the way man sees them. It's a tough question, though. Is the judgment of men and women, of very earnest and morally mature people, of no real value? Is the opposite of man's judgment always the right one in God's eyes? Doesn't God, and in this case Jesus, have any appreciation of the fact that the tax collector's a bit of a rogue and the Pharisee is a very serious man and should be taken seriously? What kind of God is this who accepts the tax collector and rejects the Pharisee? Let us try to understand this God who is acting seemingly so strangely here, and then attempt to look at the two figures as they might appear in God's eyes. The first shock that we might get is that both the Pharisee and the tax collector are part of ourselves. How many of us have led lives which we would consider, many would consider worthwhile? Been upstanding and valuable members of our community. Been honest when it would have been easy to be an opportunist. Seemingly done all the right things, and yet may cut a woeful figure at the last judgment and be condemned. And how many of us are heavily burdened with conscience? Not having been able to control urges and desires, perhaps. Maybe having made someone else unhappy. Or having been tricky when we should have been straightforward. Or having been horribly vain. Or consumed with ambition. Disgusted with oneself and not being able to cope with that. Must such a person go away judged and condemned, having lost all the self-confidence that he had once had? Or may he be assured that God accepts the sorrow and shame that he feels, and that God does not reject him, but just because he is sorrowful and ashamed, loves him and welcomes him? There is one thing that we may be sure of, which will be unacceptable to God, and that is to be counting on God's kindness by constantly making oneself out to be utterly vile and tearing oneself down by constantly babbling over one's sins and shortcomings, as many religious people do, thinking that this might impress God and soften his judgment of them. There is such a thing as confessing what is false in an effort to make one's humility an accomplishment, of thinking God will be delighted with this revealing of conscience and self-criticism. Such an attitude can get to the point of being reverse snobbery. Here, of course, we're talking about the tax collector. Some of us may be more like the tax collector than we are like the Pharisee, but with a difference. Perhaps like a tax collector who might say, I thank you, God, that I am not so proud as this Pharisee. I am an extortioner, I am a bit of a crook, and I am an adulterer. That's the way humans are. And that's what I am. But at least I admit it. And that makes me a little bit better than a lot of others. I commit fornication twice a week, and so on. But I'm an honest man, though, God, because I don't kid myself and have no illusions about myself. Let your angels sing their hallelujahs over this one singer who is honest enough to admit that he's a scoundrel and not hide behind his robes like these Pharisees do. I know this must sound all a bit extreme, turning the usually accepted and apparently obvious meanings of this parable on its head. But remember Jesus' reply to his disciples. The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, and not to them. Though seeing, they do not see, though hearing, they do not hear or understand. Remember now who Jesus was addressing on this occasion. It appears to be not the normal crowd of common people, but a group, to use the words from NIV, who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. People who saw themselves as wholly apart from all who do not possess the purity that they saw themselves as having, meaning anyone who was not of their own select group. And the thrust of the parable should be seen in that light. Was he trying to get under their skin? Almost certainly. But if it was directed at this group of self-righteous Jews, how can it apply to us? Well, as it was said before, there is much in both the Pharisee and the tax collector that we can see in ourselves, if we are honest with ourselves. But with all the parables, we would do well to consider what Jesus said to the disciples. That his reason for using parables was, again he used the word from the Message, to nudge people towards receptive insight. One thing we should keep in our mind is that both the Pharisee and the tax collector were both bound in the mesh of Old Testament laws, together with a long list of rules and regulations that the Jews had developed much later in the time of Moses, and that to obey God was to obey all of these rules. Another thing to be conscious of is that the Bible message for us is the sum of its parts. It's not just all in this parable. This is just one very small part of our Bible. That each of the parables, and was directed in this case to a particular group of people and with a particular purpose, and should be accepted that way. The blessing that we have is that we have the full story, the entire Bible, the Gospels and the writing of Jesus' inner circle, and the Old Testament, which the New puts into context. The parables are just a part of the Lord's message to us, but an important part, and worth the effort of exploring deeper meanings. The overriding fact, though, is that unlike the Pharisee and the tax collector, we are in the position to know that if we have received Jesus with all our imperfections, we are held blameless in God's sight through Jesus Christ. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the amazing free gift to us of your blessed Son, who died that we might live. And we thank you for your word, through which you tell us who you are and what you expect of us, and for the ways in which we are able to learn of you and your Son in words which are easy to understand, and then in ways in which we are encouraged to delve more deeply, and in doing so, grow to know you more. We thank you for all these things in Jesus' name.